When monitoring feels frustrating, it is usually not because the idea is wrong, but because the outcomes are not matching the effort being invested. Teams collect logs, build alerts, and stand up dashboards, yet they still miss real threats or waste time chasing noise that leads nowhere. Improving monitoring outcomes means treating monitoring like a living system that needs care, feedback, and deliberate evolution, not like a one-time installation. The fastest way to make monitoring better is to tune what you already have, validate that it works under realistic conditions, and fix coverage gaps based on evidence rather than guesswork. This episode is about building that improvement loop so the monitoring program produces clearer signals, faster decisions, and fewer blind spots over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Tuning is the practical craft of adjusting detection logic so that alerts become more meaningful and less distracting. Many beginner monitoring setups start with default rules that trigger on broad patterns, which is understandable because default rules are designed to work in many environments. The problem is that your environment has its own normal behavior, its own applications, and its own quirks, so default rules often fire too often or at the wrong times. Tuning means learning from the alerts you receive, identifying which ones are consistently unhelpful, and adjusting thresholds, filters, and context so that the signal improves. The goal is not to silence alerts so the dashboard looks quiet, but to align alerts with behaviors that truly represent risk. A useful way to think about tuning is to separate alerts into 3 buckets based on what happens after they fire. Some alerts are high value because they frequently point to real issues or near misses worth investigating. Some alerts are low value because they are almost always benign and consume time without improving safety. Some alerts are inconsistent, sometimes valuable and sometimes noisy, which usually means they need more context to become reliable. Tuning decisions should be driven by those outcomes, not by how scary an alert description sounds. When you tune based on outcomes, you steadily move the monitoring program toward alerts that earn attention. False positives are the most visible source of wasted effort, and they have a predictable effect on people over time. When analysts repeatedly investigate alerts that lead to nothing, they become slower, less motivated, and more likely to dismiss future alerts too quickly. That is why tuning is not merely a technical exercise, but also a human performance issue. Reducing false positives improves morale and frees time for deeper analysis of the alerts that remain. At the same time, tuning must avoid the opposite mistake of making rules so strict that they miss real threats, which is why tuning and validation must work together as a pair. Validation is the discipline of proving that your monitoring actually detects what you think it detects, using evidence rather than hope. A rule can look perfect on paper and still fail in practice because the necessary logs are missing, the data is not normalized, or the threshold is unrealistic. Validation can be as simple as replaying a known behavior pattern and checking whether the monitoring system produces the expected alert. It can also involve controlled simulations of suspicious activity that mimic common attack techniques without causing harm. The key idea is that validation turns assumptions into measurable performance, which is how you gain confidence that monitoring outcomes are real. Validation should be continuous because monitoring performance can drift as the environment changes. New systems come online, log formats change, applications are updated, and network paths shift, and each change can quietly break a detection rule. A rule that depended on a certain event field might stop working if the field name changes during an update. A rule that relied on a specific data source may go blind if that source stops forwarding logs. Without validation, you may not notice these failures until an incident happens, at which point the cost is much higher. Regular validation checks act like routine inspections, catching breaks early while they are easy to fix. Gap-driven coverage fixes are the third pillar, and they are often the difference between a monitoring program that feels strong and one that is full of holes. A coverage gap is a place where you cannot see what you need to see, either because a data source is missing, the telemetry is incomplete, or the logging is not detailed enough to support detection and investigation. Gaps are not always obvious during normal operations because everything seems fine until something goes wrong. The moment you try to investigate an incident and discover that key evidence does not exist, that gap becomes painfully clear. A mature monitoring program treats those moments as feedback and converts them into concrete coverage improvements. The most productive way to find coverage gaps is to start with questions you want monitoring to answer and then verify whether the data exists to answer them. If you want to detect suspicious authentication behavior, you must confirm that authentication logs are collected from the relevant systems and that they include fields needed for correlation. If you want to detect lateral movement, you must confirm that you can see internal connections and that your data has enough context to identify unusual paths. If you want to detect changes to security controls, you must confirm that administrative actions and configuration changes are logged and retained. This approach prevents you from collecting random data and instead pushes you toward coverage that supports outcomes. Once you identify a gap, fixing it often involves more than turning on a log source because the details matter. You might need to adjust what events are recorded so that critical actions are captured instead of only routine noise. You might need to normalize fields so events from different systems can be searched and correlated consistently. You might need to ensure time synchronization so timelines are reliable. You might also need to improve retention so that evidence is still available when an incident is discovered late. Gap fixes are most effective when they address the root reason the monitoring failed to support a real decision. Tuning, validation, and gap fixes become far more powerful when they are connected through a structured improvement loop. After an alert is reviewed, the team should record whether it was useful, what evidence was needed, and what slowed the decision. After a validation exercise, the team should record which detections worked, which failed, and why they failed. After an incident, the team should record which parts of the environment were visible and which were dark, and what data would have made the investigation faster. Those records should not sit unused, because they are the raw material for improvement. When you systematically feed them back into tuning and coverage work, monitoring outcomes improve steadily rather than randomly. A practical monitoring improvement loop also needs prioritization, because there will always be more potential improvements than time. The best improvements usually target the highest impact threats and the most costly operational pain. If a certain class of false positives consumes large amounts of analyst time, reducing that noise can deliver immediate benefit. If a key data source is missing from a critical segment, adding that coverage can dramatically improve detection capability. If a validation exercise reveals that a high-severity detection rule is broken, fixing it should outrank cosmetic dashboard changes. Prioritizing improvements based on impact keeps the program focused and prevents it from becoming an endless list of nice-to-haves. Consistency matters in tuning because inconsistency creates confusion and unpredictable workload. If one analyst tunes rules aggressively, while another prefers to leave everything noisy, the program will swing back and forth without progress. Establishing shared tuning principles helps, such as requiring evidence before disabling rules, documenting why thresholds were changed, and reviewing changes after a trial period. These habits keep tuning from turning into personal preference and instead make it part of disciplined operations. Over time, consistent tuning produces stable alert behavior, which makes staffing and response planning easier. Validation also benefits from consistency, especially when you use the same scenarios or checks repeatedly over time. Repeating validations helps you detect drift and prove improvement. If you validate a detection today and it works, you want to know whether it still works next month after system changes. If you tune an alert to reduce noise, you want to validate that the change did not break your ability to catch real issues. This is why validation should not be reserved for rare moments, because routine validation turns monitoring into something measurable and dependable. Measurable monitoring is harder to ignore and easier to defend to leadership when investments are questioned. Gap-driven coverage fixes can feel slow because they often involve coordination with other teams, but they are also where monitoring becomes more mature. Adding a missing log source may require permissions, configuration changes, or agreement on what data should be collected. Improving retention may require budgeting and storage planning. Normalization may require careful mapping and testing. These steps are not glamorous, but they build the foundation that makes everything else work. When teams accept that coverage work is part of monitoring success, They stop treating missing data as unavoidable and start treating it as a solvable problem. A subtle but important part of improving outcomes is aligning monitoring with human workflows, because detections only matter if someone can act on them. If alerts arrive without context, analysts must spend extra time gathering basic details before making a decision. If alerts arrive without clear severity logic, analysts may overreact or underreact. If alerts arrive without reliable correlation, analysts may miss the bigger picture. Improving outcomes, therefore, often means enriching alerts with asset criticality, identity context, and relevant history, so the first few minutes of triage are faster. Small improvements in alert usability can have large effects on response speed and quality. When you step back and look at monitoring as a whole, the best programs do not aim for perfect detection, because perfection is not realistic in complex environments. Instead, they aim for continuous improvement that steadily increases coverage, reduces noise, and proves that detections work. Tuning refines signal quality, validation proves performance, and gap-driven fixes repair blind spots that real incidents reveal. Together, these practices create a monitoring system that becomes more accurate, more trusted, and more actionable over time. If you keep that loop alive, monitoring stops being a noisy dashboard and becomes a reliable engine that helps you catch threats earlier and respond with greater confidence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.